The Last Horseshoe Prologue. Friday, October 14th, 1988, morning, Columbus, Ohio. The alarm went off at 6:15. Same as always. Keith Barnett silenced it without opening his eyes, swung his feet to the floor, and sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment the way he always did, gathering himself, taking inventory. Knees, lower back, the dull pressure behind his eyes that passed for rested these days. 58 years old, and the mornings had gotten longer since the last time he'd felt anything you could call young. He stood, crossed the bedroom in 6 steps, and turned on the bathroom light. He checked the mirror before he picked up the razor. Every morning. Still. 6 years of still. 6 years of standing in front of this same bathroom mirror on Livingston Avenue, razor in hand, doing a count before anything else. The glass showed him what it always showed him. A man who had aged into the shape of himself, greyer than he liked, heavier through the middle than he used to be, the smoker's lines cut deep around his mouth. His reflection. Only ever his reflection. This morning was different. He raised the razor and caught movement behind him in the glass. His own reflection looked back. Just his reflection. But for a half second, less than a half second, there was something else in the space behind his right shoulder where the bathroom wall should have been. Not a shape he could name. Not a face. A presence. The suggestion of a presence. The quality of air that has changed because something has entered it that has no business being there. Gone, before he could look directly at it. Gone so fast he could almost believe he'd imagined it. He finished shaving. His hands were steady. That was the thing about routine. It held you when nothing else would. His hand didn't shake. The razor moved the way it always moved. When he rinsed his face and looked up again, there was nothing behind him but the towel rack and the door to the hallway and the ordinary pale light of an October morning. He went to the kitchen and poured coffee. Sarah Connolly's obituary photo was on the refrigerator. It had been there for 6 years, taped to the upper left corner of the freezer door with a strip of masking tape he'd replaced twice when the edges curled back. The photo showed a woman in her late 20s, with dark hair and careful eyes. The kind of photo that newspapers ran when a person died and no one had a better one. Sarah Connolly, 29. Hit and run, September 1982. The driver never found. Harold McKinnon's business card was taped beside it. Yellowed now at the edges, the ink slightly faded. Harold McKinnon, hand-printed in blue ballpoint above a Willow's Bend address and a phone number Keith had never once dialed. He poured his coffee and stood in front of the refrigerator and drank it, looking at the photo and the card the way he did most mornings. It was part of the routine, the check, the reminder. You know what happened. You know what you did. You know what it cost someone else. The passenger never fully left. He'd known that for 8 months now. It had started in February, a Tuesday fare from the airport, nothing unusual. A businessman with too much luggage and not enough patience who didn't tip. Keith had pulled back into traffic and checked his mirror to merge, and the back seat, the empty back seat, had looked wrong. Not occupied, not showing him anything he could point to and name. Just wrong. The quality of the air in the back seat wrong, in the way, you know, a room is wrong when you walk into it after someone has been upset there. He'd told himself it was nothing. He was 57 years old, and he'd spent 3 days at Ironwood Retreat in September of 1982, and he'd done what was required of him, and he'd survived. He'd carried it forward, one day at a time. He'd kept the photo on the refrigerator, and kept the card beside it, and kept the promise he'd made in that place, to that reflection, to Sarah Connolly's face in a mirror that had no business showing him what it showed him. That was enough. It had to be enough. But February became March, and March became April, and the back seat kept being wrong on certain fares. Not every fare. Specific ones. Fares he couldn't track to any pattern except the wrongness itself. And the mirrors. Not just the cab's rearview mirror, but all of them. Any reflective surface on the bad days. His bathroom mirror. The window glass at the diner on Broad Street where he had his lunch. The display case at the hardware store. And the cold. The cold that found the cab on clear days when the heat was working fine, and the temperature outside was 42 degrees, and there was no reason for the back of his neck to go tight and the air around him to sharpen the way it sharpened on certain fares, certain stretches of certain routes, as if something had settled in behind him. For now, Frank Harmon had said in 1982. You're safe for now. Those two words had been getting louder for 8 months. Keith set down his coffee cup, took Harold McKinnon's card off the refrigerator, turned it over in his hands. The card had a phone number on it, a Willow's Bend exchange. He'd looked the number up once, 3 years back. It was listed. He could call it right now. He could call it and say, "This is Keith Barnett. I was at Ironwood Retreat in 1982. I think it's coming back. What do I do?" He didn't call. He didn't have a number for Frank, and Frank was the one who understood the mechanics of the thing. Harold was the one who dealt in the larger picture, the one Keith only half understood. What Keith understood was the passenger. What Keith understood was Unit 8 and the horseshoe and the rules, and what happened when you held to them. He put the card in his shirt pocket, grabbed his jacket off the hook by the door, picked up his keys. The Checker Marathon was in the parking lot where it always was. 10 years old now, the yellow paint dulled in places, the fenders showing their age, the odometer turned past what Keith usually admitted to. He kept it running because it was the cab he knew, the cab that knew him, the cab he'd been driving for Columbus Cab Company since before it had this many miles on it. He got in, adjusted the mirror, started the engine. He checked the rearview mirror before he pulled out. The back seat was empty. He could see the cracked vinyl, the worn spot on the left side where fares had been getting in and out for 10 years, the strip of morning light falling across the floor mat. Empty. Wrong. He pulled out of the lot and headed south on Livingston, took Route 33 to 23, drove through the city, thinning out into the strip malls and subdivisions, thinning out into the highway. The Columbus skyline went small in his mirrors and disappeared. He was heading for Chillicothe, and then the turn onto Maple Grove Road, and then the Creek Bridge and the gravel drive and whatever waited for him at the end of it. The fall foliage was at its peak. Both sides of the highway blazing with it, red and orange and gold running back through the tree lines in colors that seemed almost too saturated to be real, almost theatrical, almost like something that was trying to be beautiful enough to make you stop looking at what was underneath the beauty. He stopped once, outside Circleville. A diner, on the right side of Route 23, the kind of place with a gravel lot and a hand-painted sign and coffee that had been on the burner since morning. He pulled in and sat in a booth by the window for 40 minutes with a cup he didn't finish, watching the traffic move south on the highway. Trucks mostly. A few families in station wagons. Nobody going where he was going. He took Harold's card out of his shirt pocket once and looked at it and put it back. He left $1 on the table and got back in the cab. Keith's eyes went to the rearview mirror every few minutes after that. The highway behind him, the cab behind him, the back seat empty and wrong and quiet, the October light flat and pale through the rear window. He drove south. The last horseshoe scene won. Ironwood Retreat, Grindstone Hollow, Ohio. Frank Harmon had learned a long time ago not to trust October. The hollow looked its best in October. That was the problem. The sugar maples were doing what they did this time of year, burning through their colors like they had spent a great effort on it, red into orange, into gold. And the air had that sharp, clean edge that made breathing feel like something worth doing deliberately. Nakin Creek ran clear and cold through the tree line. You could hear it from the compound if the wind was right, and the sky above the hollow was the particular shade of blue that only showed up in the second week of October, when the haze of summer had finally burned off and winter hadn't yet put its grey weight on everything. Beautiful. Frank noted this the way he noted everything about the hollow, which was carefully and without sentiment. The hollow used its beauty the way a fisherman used bait. It was most deceptive in October. He had learned that the hard way in the early years, when he'd still been capable of being caught off guard by a pretty afternoon. He was on Unit 3's east-facing window frame with a caulking gun, working the old weathered bead loose and running a new line, when the yellow cab turned into the drive. He set the gun down on the windowsill and straightened. Watched it come up the gravel. A Checker Marathon, older model, paint dulled by miles, moving with the careful speed of a driver who knew the road was gravel and didn't want to kick stones up into the undercarriage. Frank didn't recognize the cab immediately. He'd seen a cab like it before, but 6 years changes a vehicle the way 6 years changes a person, settles things, wears things down, makes the familiar look different before it looks familiar again. The driver's door opened and a man got out. Late 50s, grey-haired, heavier through the middle than he'd been. He moved with the careful steadiness of someone who was managing something internal and had been managing it long enough that the management itself had become automatic. He closed the cab door and looked around the compound, and Frank knew him before he could see his face clearly. Keith Barnett, the taxi driver from September 1982. He'd survived the passenger. He'd driven away changed, and Frank had watched the cab turn onto Maple Grove Road and thought, as he often thought when they drove away, "I hope that's the end of it for you." They almost never came back. Frank wiped his hands on a rag and came down from the window. He crossed the gravel slowly, giving Keith time to get his bearings, taking his own time to read the man. The reading was the work. Everything else followed from it. Keith saw him coming and held still, waiting, not calling out, not moving toward him, a man who'd been to this place before and knew that you didn't rush the approach. "Keith Barnett," Frank said when he was close enough. "That's right." Keith's voice was steady, a little rough, the voice of a man who'd smoked for 30-some years and wasn't going to stop. "You look the same." "I don't," Frank said. "Neither do you. Come out of the sun." They stood in the shade of the lodge overhang, not a warm reunion. It wasn't that kind of thing. What it was genuine. Two men who shared a type of experience that no one without the same experience could enter, who looked at each other and knew they were understood in the particular way that mattered. Frank let the silence sit for a moment. "When did it start?" he said. Keith didn't ask what he meant. "February. 8 months back." "Tell me," Keith told him. He told it the way Keith always talked. Frank remembered that from 6 years ago, in specific increments, like he was reporting a fare log. Dates and times and the particular quality of each incident. The back seat on a Tuesday airport fare in February. The mirrors through March. The cold that started in April and hadn't stopped. He told it without drama, which was its own kind of weight. A man recounting something he'd been carrying alone for 8 months and was too experienced with it to overly explain it. Frank listened without interrupting. When Keith finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said something when you were here before, about carrying it forward, one day at a time." "Yeah, you been doing that?" Keith looked at him steadily. "Every day, for 6 years. But it's not enough." "No," Keith said. "It's not." Frank nodded once. That was the shape of it then. The confession in 1982 had been real. Frank had seen it, had felt the shift in the hollow's quality afterward, the particular settling that happened when something true got said. But the passenger was back, which meant the confession hadn't been complete. There was a layer underneath that Keith had either not reached or not admitted to. The passenger had been waiting for 6 years. Patient as the hollow itself. "The back seat," Frank said. "The manifestation in the cab. That's new." "Is it bad?" "It's different. In 1982 it stayed in reflective surfaces." Keith's jaw worked slightly. "It's been in both, mirrors and the cab." Frank noted this. Filed it. Something had changed in the hollow's behavior since the previous year, since the 2 deaths in July 1987, since the hollow went satisfied silent afterward in a way that had kept Frank sleeping lighter and watching more carefully. The passenger operating in open air was outside its established rules. He'd think about what that meant. Later. "Come on," Frank said. "I'll put you in Unit 8. "Same one?" "Same one." Keith was quiet for a moment. "That deliberate?" "Yes." Frank picked up Keith's bag before the man could reach for it. "The passenger knows that unit. Better to keep it in territory it already understands than let it range." They crossed the compound to Unit 8. Frank unlocked the door. The horseshoe was above it the way it had always been above it, iron grey against the log frame, on the nail that had been there since the units were built. Frank watched Keith look up at it. Something in the man's face went quiet when he saw it, the way people's faces went quiet when they saw something they'd been trying not to need. Inside, Frank set the bag on the bed and went through the protocol. Keith listened without fidgeting, his hands at his sides, the attentive stillness of a man who had done this before, and understood that this was not the part you skipped through. The rules. Don't turn around if you hear your name. Don't engage anything in a reflective surface tonight. Keep every light on. The horseshoe stays in your hands when you're not sleeping and on the nightstand where you can reach it when you are. I know, Keith said once. I know you know, Frank said. Say it anyway. Keith said it back. All of it, from the top, in the flat, methodical way he had. Frank listened and watched him and read him while he talked. He survived once. He knows what's required. He came back, which means there's something he didn't finish, something he hasn't said yet. The passenger knew it too. That's why it's back. What the second thing was, Frank didn't know yet. He had a read on it, a direction. There was something underneath what Keith had confessed in 1982, some layer he was circling without landing on. It was there in the set of the man's shoulders, in the precision he used when he talked about 1982, in the small gap between what he said and what he very nearly said. Frank had sat with enough guests to recognize a man who was not quite all the way telling the truth, not because he was lying, but because he hadn't fully found the truth yet himself. He didn't push, not now. Now wasn't the time. There's no other guests this weekend, Frank said, picking up the caulking gun he'd left by the door. You've got the compound. Keith nodded. Then, quietly, I didn't want to come back. Frank looked at him. I know. But it wasn't. Letting go, Frank said. No, Keith said. It wasn't. Frank went out and left him there. He walked back toward Unit 3 and finished the caulking job, moving the gun along the window frame with the steady automatic competence of a man who'd been doing this kind of work for decades. The sun was getting low, throwing long shadows across the compound, the hollow's colours deepening as the light shifted from afternoon into early evening, red into deeper red. The creak sound coming clearer now in the cooling air. He looked back once at Unit 8. Keith was on the porch. He'd sat in the rocking chair, had his forearms on his knees, and was looking out at the hollow with the expression of a man who was trying to take in something he'd spent 6 years convincing himself he'd seen the last of. Beautiful, Frank thought, looking at the blazing tree line. He didn't trust it. The last horseshoe scene, too. Frank made a simple dinner. Pork chops, potatoes, green beans from the can. The kind of meal that required attention but not thought, which was the point. Cooking left the part of his mind that mattered free to work. Keith came in from Unit 8 around 6 and sat at the far end of the table, the same end he'd sat at in 1982, without being told. Some things the body remembered without asking permission. Frank set the plates and they ate, and the conversation that happened between two people with weight and history between them happened the way those conversations always did, slowly, with long silences that weren't uncomfortable, with a certain care about where to start. Keith started. He was ready to start. Frank could see it, the way you could see it in anyone who'd been carrying something alone for long enough that the carrying itself had become its own kind of weight. February 3rd, Keith said. Tuesday. Airport fare, Columbus to the Radisson on Broad. Nothing unusual. On the way back, empty cab, I checked the mirror to merge and... He stopped, started again. It wasn't anything I could name. The back seat looked right, but it felt wrong. The way a room feels wrong when something bad happened in it. Frank said nothing. March it got worse. Not every day. Maybe every 3-4 days. One of those fares where the cab just felt occupied even when it wasn't. And the mirrors started. Not just in the cab. Bathroom mirror at home. Diner windows. Once at the hardware store, the glass on the display case. Keith pushed a piece of potato around his plate. I told myself I was imagining it. Did you believe that? For about a week. Keith set his fork down. No, I didn't believe it. He kept going. He went through the spring, the summer, all of it. Specific dates when he could remember them. Specific routes. Specific fares. A Saturday in April on the Hilton run, when the cold hit so fast, his breath fogged the interior glass, even though the heat had been running for 20 minutes. A June Wednesday when he'd seen something in his bathroom mirror that was almost Sarah's face, and had been so far from Sarah's face that the almost was worse than the full thing would have been. He named the incidents the way a man names stops on a route. This one, then this one, then this one. A log of the 8 months keeping him company in the dark. Frank listened. 8. Listened. When Keith finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. "The back seat," he said. "When it manifests there, you're certain there's nothing in the reflective surfaces at the same time?" Keith thought about it. "Yes, it's one or the other, not both." Frank nodded. He was thinking about the Hollow's behavior since July 1987. The way the creatures had been operating beyond their established parameters, or at least the one that had. The passenger operating in open air was new. It worried him in a way he wasn't yet ready to put into words. "When it came at you in the mirrors," Frank said, "was it still Sarah?" "Mostly." Keith's voice stayed even. "Her face, the way she looked in 1982. Mostly. Sometimes." He stopped, picked up his coffee cup, set it back down. "Sometimes something else, behind her, or instead of her. I couldn't ever get a clear look. A person. A shape, I don't know. A suggestion of something." Frank didn't push, but he noted it carefully, put it in the place where he kept the things that needed time before they revealed their shape. There was a second face. Something Keith hadn't identified yet, something that hadn't shown itself fully yet, and that was almost certainly the shape of what this visit was for. Not the confession Keith had already made. Something underneath it. "You did right, coming here," Frank said. "I almost didn't." "I know." Keith looked at him across the table. "Does it ever happen someone knows it's coming back, and they just don't come? They try to wait it out?" Frank looked at him steadily. "That's not a conversation that ends with them here to tell me about it." Keith was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, the nod of a man who had already known the answer and had just needed to hear it said plainly. The siren came at 8:47, the way it always did. The sound rose from the direction of the mill ruins, out through the tree line, across the compound. It wasn't loud. It never needed to be. It had a particular quality that cut through whatever else was happening in the air and made itself the only thing you were aware of for the duration. Frank had heard it every night for 10 years. He no longer flinched at it, or felt it in his chest the way he had in the early years. He heard it the way you heard a clock striking midnight, the acknowledgement of a fact rather than the discovery of one. Keith's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He sat very still. His eyes went to the window and stayed there, not seeing the window, not seeing anything. His knuckles had gone white around the cup handle. The siren rose and held and dropped and faded into the tree line, into the creek noise, into the October dark. When it was fully gone, Keith set the cup down on the table with more care than was strictly necessary. The deliberateness of a man reassembling himself one controlled movement at a time. "Still right on time," he said. "Every night," Frank said. "Does it ever?" Keith didn't finish. "No," Frank said. "Just the once." Keith looked at him. Frank looked back. The second siren from July 1987 was not a piece of information Keith needed tonight. It would complicate rather than help, and tonight was already complicated enough. After a while, Keith asked about the Hollow, the general shape of the last 6 years, and Frank told him what there was to tell without telling him more than he needed. The units, the maintenance, the work. Frank described it the way he described everything about this place to the people who passed through it, as fact, without drama, with the plainness of a man reporting on a job he'd been doing for a long time and expected to keep doing. Around 10, Frank pushed back from the table and got the horseshoe from the shelf behind the kitchen. He set it on the table in front of Keith. The iron was warm, the warmth it always had, the warmth that was its nature rather than the room's temperature. "You know the rules," Frank said. "Say it anyway," Keith said. Frank almost smiled. "Say it anyway. Every light on. Don't turn around if I hear my name. Don't engage anything in a reflective surface tonight." Keith picked up the horseshoe and held it in both hands the way Frank had shown him in 1982, the way that kept the most iron in contact with the skin. "Not tonight." "The first night is reconnaissance," Frank said. "It's not going to try anything that costs it. It's going to test the edges. You hold the iron and you keep the lights on and you wait it out. That's all." Keith stood. He was a little stiff when he stood, The way men in their late 50s got stiff from sitting too long, the body making its opinions known. He put on his jacket. Frank. Yeah. Whatever it is I didn't say before. He paused. I don't know what it is yet. I know you don't, Frank said. That's all right. You will. He watched Keith cross the compound, the gravel lit by the lodge's exterior light, the unit doors visible in a row, the horseshoes above them catching the light in small iron-grey glints. Keith's shadow moved ahead of him, and then he was up the 2 steps onto Unit 8's porch and through the door, and the windows came on one by one as he turned on every light in the unit the way Frank had told him. Frank stood at the lodge window for a moment. Unit 8 lit up and warm-looking. The other units dark, all of them dark tonight. He let his eyes move along the row of them. Unit 9, Unit 10, at the far north end of the compound, the units farthest from the lodge. He looked at the horseshoes above their doors and couldn't see them clearly in the dark, and told himself that was fine. The hollow was quiet. The October night was still, the creek running under the quiet, the tree line dark against the darker sky. But the quality of the stillness was not right. He knew this hollow's quiet, knew every register of it after 10 years, knew the difference between the hollow resting and the hollow waiting. There was a watching quality to the stillness tonight that had nothing to do with Keith Barnett or the passenger, something that had its attention turned toward the compound from a direction Frank couldn't quite locate. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he turned off the lodge lights, checked the lock on the door, and went to his chair. He didn't sleep for a while. The last horseshoe, scene 3. The unit smelled the same. Keith had expected it to smell different. 6 years, other guests, other lives passing through, but it was the same underlayer of pine cleaner and wood smoke and the faint mineral edge of Nakin Creek drifting through the window seams. Unit 8. The same dresser, the same mirror above it. He had positioned himself on the near edge of the bed with his back to the mirror. Every light in the unit was burning. The overhead, the lamp on the nightstand, the lamp on the dresser, the bathroom light with the door open far enough to throw a stripe of yellow across the floor. He had pulled the nightstand lamp cord so it faced the corner behind him. He wasn't sure it mattered. He did it anyway. The horseshoe was in both hands. He had stopped checking his watch sometime around 10:30 when the minutes had started to feel like something he was moving through rather than something that was moving. He sat with his feet flat on the floor and his elbows on his knees and the iron bracketed between his palms, which was an odd posture for a man of 58, but felt structurally correct, the way sitting low in a cab during a windstorm felt structurally correct. You found your base. You held it. Outside, the hollow, the creek, the October dark. Nothing wrong with any of it. Nothing he could hear. He thought about what Frank had said or hadn't said. Something he hasn't said yet. That's why it's back. He'd been turning the line over all evening, the way you worried a splinter you could feel but couldn't locate, and he was no closer to it than he'd been in the parking lot. He'd told Sarah the truth in this unit 6 years ago. The whole truth. That he was relieved. That he'd gone home after her death with relief mixed in alongside the guilt, and the guilt had been genuine, and the relief had been genuine, and the second one had seemed to him then like the worst thing he'd ever known about himself. He had said it out loud, to the mirror. He had meant it. But Frank had said something else tonight at the dinner table, looking at his coffee cup. The passenger's precise. He hadn't elaborated, and Keith hadn't pushed. Precise. The cold came at midnight. Not the window, not the October air bleeding through the seams. The mirror. He could not see it. He was not going to look at it. But he could feel the cold establishing itself behind him, the way you felt a weather shift before the sky changed. A directional thing. The cold had a direction, and the direction was the mirror. The temperature in the unit dropped in a different way than temperature dropped from a fixed point rather than settling evenly from the walls and floor. The horseshoe was warm in his hands, and there was a clear line where the warm ended and the cold began, maybe 4 feet from where he sat, and that line held. He was aware of his own breathing. He regulated it. Then his name, Keith, not Sarah's voice. Sarah's voice he remembered, He had carried it for 6 years, the flat Midwestern vowels, the note underneath that was not accusation exactly, but a cousin of it. What he heard was not her voice. It was a voice that wore the shape of his own voice, the way a coat hangs on a frame, recognizably his in pitch and cadence, and then wrong in some quality he couldn't assign a word to, as if his voice had been learned from the outside rather than lived from the inside. He didn't turn around. He gripped the horseshoe and held position and thought about the Checker Marathon sitting in the lot behind him. The way the back seat felt on clear day runs, the particular quality of wrong that had no name because it wasn't coming from anything visible. He had driven 300 days since February with that wrongness in the back seat, noting it in his fare log the way he noted everything. 8:15 a.m., no fare, backseat temp anomalous, no cause identified. He had a driver's discipline about the inexplicable. You logged it. You did not stop on a live road to examine it. You held your lane. You kept your eyes on the road in front of you. The shapes came next. Peripheral. He had learned, 6 years ago, that peripheral was where it worked hardest, where the human eye gave it the most room to be something that couldn't be looked at directly. He kept his gaze forward, on the far wall, on the small painting of a covered bridge that had been there in 1982 and was still there now, slightly crooked, paint yellowed at the edges. He put everything he had into the covered bridge, and the horseshoe, and his breathing. The shapes were not specific. That was the thing he had not been able to adequately convey to Frank tonight over dinner, though Frank had listened with the focused attention of a man who already knew. The shapes were not the woman from the back seat, not Sarah Connolly's outline and broken arm. They were something behind or instead of her, a presence that did not have the form the passenger usually wore, and every time he tried to look at it directly it was gone, and there was only the corner, the yellow light, the pine cleaner smell. His name again. Keith. Twice, the same wrong voice. The third time it wasn't his name, and it wasn't a word. He had no category for it. A sound that was almost recognizable as human sound, almost the shape of language, but with some essential register missing, as if a voice were attempting to speak through equipment it did not fully understand. It came from the mirror. He was certain it came from the mirror. It lasted 4 seconds, maybe 5, and then the ordinary sounds of the hollow came back. The creak, the wind, the October quiet. The cold intensified. He felt it against the back of his neck, against the back of his hands, where they held the horseshoe. Not the 4-foot line anymore, but closer. And the horseshoe pushed back. He could feel it pushing back, the way you felt the resistance of a steering wheel when you held a curve hard, something that required application, something with weight. He applied himself to holding it. His hands ached. He was 58, and the iron was cold on his skin, even through the warmth the ward was generating. A contradiction that didn't make sense mechanically, and was nevertheless what he felt. The second face again, at the periphery. Not Sarah, not a stranger, not the driver he had never seen, whose face had never appeared in the paper because the investigation had dead-ended and the sheriff's department had moved on. He had been aware of the second face since February, or thought he'd been aware of it, the way you were sometimes aware of a wrong note in a song you'd heard enough times to know. But tonight, it was closer to resolving, and it was not the driver's face. He was sure of that much, and not sure of anything else. He held position. At 2:30 a.m., by the nightstand clock, the cold retreated. Not gradually. In stages. One moment the cold was present, and the horseshoe was working, and his name had not been spoken again, but the potential of it was still in the room, and then the potential was gone, and then the cold was gone, and then the mirror behind him was just a mirror. He could feel the shift, the way a pressure change shifted in your ears in a descending aircraft. Pop. Done. Night sounds again. Creak. Wind. His own breathing, which had been very controlled for 2.5 hours and was now slightly less controlled. He sat on the edge of the bed until dawn. He held the horseshoe in both hands because Frank had not said to put it down, and he did not want to put it down. And he thought about the second face that had not resolved, and the word precise, and the question Frank had not asked at dinner, which was the question he did not yet have an answer to. He was aware of the horseshoe's warmth against his palms, He was aware of the covered bridge painting, crooked on its nail. He was aware of the October dark outside the window beginning, somewhere around 5:30, to grade from black toward grey. He did not sleep. Frank did his rounds at 1 a.m. He came out of the lodge with the rebar through his belt loop and the flashlight in his left hand, and did the circuit he had done every occupied night for 6 years, since the last time Keith Barnett had been in Unit 8, and Frank had paced the compound all night, because something in the quality of the hollow's silence had been wrong enough that sleeping seemed like poor judgment. Tonight was different from that night, but the decision felt the same. He checked Unit 1 first, nearest the lodge. Horseshoe, room temperature, no activity. He moved south along the row. 2, 3, 4. All room temperature, all dark, all quiet, no guests. At Unit 5 he stopped and put his hand to the iron and held it for a moment and listened to the hollow. October wind. The creek, nothing else. Unit 8's horseshoe was warm. Frank took his hand away and stood there for a moment with the warmth in his palm. Not hot, not alarmed hot, just the baseline working warmth that meant the ward was functioning. The iron was doing what the iron did with a guilt-carrying guest in the room, and something was pressing against it. He considered the warm light visible around the edges of Unit 8's curtains. Every lamp going, the bathroom light on. He had told Keith no unnecessary light use at the siren briefing. He had apparently not mentioned that he'd meant it for the first night too, though the intent had been clear. He did not knock. Some things you did not interrupt. He crossed the compound to the north end. Units 9 and 10 sat at the far end of the row, dark, no guests since August. He checked 9's horseshoe out of habit, the same way he checked all of them, the way his father had taught him. Flat palm, steady pressure, wait for the read. The read came immediately. Cold. Not the October air cold of a metal object outdoors at 1 in the morning. The other cold, the battery with nothing left cold, the cold of iron that had been worked against something and spent itself. The cold he associated with aftermath, with the night after. Not with a night that was still happening. A horseshoe ran cold after a bad event. After something had pressed hard enough that the ward had depleted. Not during, but nothing had happened at Unit 9. No guests, no event. He checked Unit 10. Same. Frank stood between the two units, with the rebar in his hand and the flashlight aimed at the ground, and he turned the readings over the way you turned a bad set of numbers over, looking for the interpretation that made sense. The rebar was not humming, not a trace of response, not the faint warmth it produced when something in the hollow's established order was active, and the iron could identify it and push back. The rebar knew guilt fed things. The rebar knew grief fed things. The rebar had a response for every evil he had encountered in 10-odd years of keeping this watch. The rebar was cold and completely still. He looked toward the tree line. 80 feet from the north end of the compound, the October trees stood in their own darkness, leaves not quite off the branches yet, the canopy not yet thinned enough to let the sky through properly. He could see nothing in the tree line. He could hear nothing beyond the creek and the wind. Nothing moved. Nothing was visible. But something had been standing near Units 9 and 10. He was certain of it. Not a category he had a name for. Not a creature the iron recognized. Something that had leaned against these horseshoes, the way you leaned against a door in the dark. Not trying to enter, just making itself known. Making itself known to the iron without making itself known to anything else. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked the perimeter back to the lodge, checking every unit as he went, not because he expected to find anything, but because doing the thing you were supposed to do was the only answer to a question you had no framework for. He made note of the depleted horseshoes, and made note of the rebar's silence, and made note of the fact that nothing in 10 years of keeping watch had depleted a horseshoe without an event. He sat in the lodge's front chair with the rebar across his knees. He was still sitting there at 3 a.m. when the hollow outside was exactly as quiet as it was supposed to be, and he was thinking about the wrong cold in the north units and about the question he had no name for yet, which he recognized as the kind of question that named itself only after it had already told you what it was. He did not sleep. The Last Horseshoe, Scene 4. Frank had the coffee going by 6:30. He had not slept, and had not attempted to, which was not unusual for him on an occupied night, though usually the reason was a guest who needed managing, and this time he had two separate things to manage, and only one of them was a guest. He made the coffee strong, which was the only way he made it, and he scrambled eggs in the cast-iron skillet, because it was a task that required nothing from him beyond the doing of it. And he thought about dead horseshoes, and what he was going to tell Keith Barnett, and what he was going to keep to himself for now. The porch light at Unit 8 had been burning since 10 o'clock. That was good. That was the right call. Keith came in at 7:15. He knocked once on the lodge doorframe before he opened it, which Frank noted. A man who respected thresholds, who had learned over 6 years to take that kind of thing seriously. He looked like what he was, which was a man who had not slept and had not expected to. His face was steady enough, but there was a quality behind his eyes of something recently survived. A man who had climbed out of a car wreck and was still in the process of determining his own damage. He sat at the counter without being asked and put the horseshoe down in front of him. Frank set a mug next to it and filled it. He put the eggs on a plate and slid them across and sat down on the other stool with his own mug and waited. Keith ate, not fast, not slow, the methodical way of a man fueling himself because the work requires it, not because he's hungry. The mirror went cold around midnight, Keith said between bites. Not the cold from last time. Faster. Harder. How fast? The temperature dropped before I'd checked the clock, Masca. I looked at the nightstand at 11:58 and the cold was already there. Frank filed this. The passenger on an accelerated schedule was not a surprise given 8 months of backseat presence, but the timeline was earlier than he had expected. Voice, Frank said. Wrong pitch, close to mine, not mine. Keith set down his fork. Not Sarah's. How many times? 3. My name twice. Then something I didn't have a word for. A sound like it was working on a frequency it hadn't figured out yet. He picked up the fork again. And the second face, at the edges. I didn't look at it directly. That was right. I know. I remembered. A pause. It's not the driver, Frank. I don't know what it is, but it's not the driver. Frank looked at his coffee. He had suspected this from the description Keith had given him at dinner. The shape at the periphery that was not Sarah Connolly's familiar, grief-worn outline, but something else. Something that hadn't resolved into an identifiable form. The passenger was precise, as he'd told Keith last night. It didn't improvise. If there was a second face, the second face had a source. Think about what you confessed last time, Frank said. What you told her. Keith set the fork down again. He understood what Frank was asking. I told Sarah the ugly truth, he said. I told her I was relieved. That when she died, I was relieved it was her and not me. That I went home with relief mixed in with the guilt, and the relief was real. He said it the way a man recites something he has recited many times in the dark, a kind of practiced evenness. I didn't flinch from it. I said it out loud to the mirror, all of it. I know you did. And she faded. Sarah faded. And it was done. I know that too. So why is there a second face? Frank poured more coffee for both of them without being asked. The lodge was quiet. Through the front window, the hollow blazed with October. The maple line along the far fence lit up gold and amber in the morning light, the kind of morning that would have sold the place on sight if Frank were still trying to sell it. He was not looking at the trees. Since then, Frank said. 6 years. Is that still the whole truth? Keith didn't answer immediately. He looked at his coffee cup. I told her what happened at the accident, Keith said. I told her why I drove past. All of it. I know what you told her. Frank waited. I'm asking if there's more. Keith was quiet for long enough that Frank poured himself a second cup and sat back down before Keith spoke again. I don't know. You do, Frank said. You just haven't said it yet. A longer silence. The October light moved in the window as the wind came through the maples. Keith's hands were on either side of the coffee mug, not holding it, steadying himself against the counter. I'm not sure I know how, Keith said finally. You'll work it out. That's why you came back. Frank said it the way he said most things, flat and without comfort on the surface of it. But Keith had known him long enough, 6 years and one crisis, to understand that the flatness was not coldness. It was a different thing. The passenger came back because the 1982 confession was real. It was not incomplete in the sense of being a lie. It was incomplete in the sense that there was a layer underneath what you said, underneath what you knew to say. Frank drank his coffee. It's been waiting for that layer. Keith nodded slowly. He was logging this the way he logged fares: date, route, relevant conditions. Frank could see him doing it. There's something else, Frank said. Keith looked up. During my rounds last night, north end of the compound, units 9 and 10, empty units, no guests. He said it without preamble. I found something that has no explanation I can give you right now, unrelated to the passenger, unrelated to you. He met Keith's eyes. I'd like you to stay near the lodge today, not inside the lodge, but near it, within easy sight of it. Keith was quiet for a moment. You're managing something, Keith said. Yes. Is it going to interfere with tonight? No. Frank said it with the steadiness of a man who wasn't entirely certain and was choosing to be certain, because being uncertain out loud would not help either of them. Tonight is about you and the passenger. Whatever else is in the hollow is operating on a different frequency. I'm watching it. That's my job. Keith looked at him for a moment, reading, the way Keith always read people, with the particular attention of a man whose professional life had taught him that the back seat of a car was the most honest place in the world. All right, Keith said. They finished breakfast without talking much. Afterward, Frank washed the plates, and Keith stood at the window, looking out at the compound, at Unit 8 across the lot with its porch light still burning in the daylight, unnecessary now, and left on anyway. Frank dried the skillet and hung it and came to stand next to him. Go work on it, Frank said. Whatever it is, it'll come. They took their coffee onto the porch. The morning was cold and clear, and the hollow lay in front of them, ravishing with its October colour, the way it was every October, the way it had been every October for as long as Frank had been keeping this watch. He did not trust it. He stood at the porch rail with his coffee and watched the tree line at the north end of the compound, where the shadows beneath the canopy were not yet wrong, but had a quality he was paying close attention to. Keith sat in the wooden chair with his horseshoe on the armrest and his coffee in his hand, and turned something over in his mind. They sat like that for a while, in the October morning, not talking. The last horseshoe, scene 5. They walked the compound perimeter after noon. Frank's stated reason was routine horseshoe checks, which was true and was also cover, and Keith understood both halves of this without either of them naming the arrangement. Keith walked with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and his eyes on the ground, in the way of a man who was working something interior, and Frank walked with the rebar at his belt and his eyes on the horseshoes and the wood of the fence line, and the behaviour of the shadows at the tree line, which were doing something they should not be doing yet for this hour of the afternoon. He checked the south end units first. 1 through 5, iron good, no activity, the ordinary room temperature reading of unoccupied iron doing nothing particular. He noted each without commentary. Keith walked alongside in a silence Frank did not interrupt. The silence had a productive quality, the quality of something working toward the surface, and Frank had learned over many years that some silences were more useful than anything he could say into them. Unit 8, he checked last on the south side. The horseshoe above Unit 8's door carried the residual warmth of the previous night's encounter. Not active warmth, not working warmth, but a fading warmth like the heat in a stone after the fire goes out, correct. Then the north end. He put his hand to Unit 9's horseshoe. Keith had stopped 6 feet back and was looking at the creek line, at the way Nakin Creek glittered through the trees on the downslope beyond the fence. But Frank noticed, without being obvious about it, that Keith had also noticed Frank's hand staying on the iron longer than it had stayed on any of the others. Unit 9, still dead. Colder, even, than last night, or the same dead cold, more apparent now because the afternoon was mild and the contrast was stark. Unit 10, same. His palm came away cold in a way October air did not account for. He did not say anything. He looked at the fence boards nearest the 2 units. Good boards, solid construction, oak posts he had set himself 8 years ago. He put his hand to the post between units 9 and 10 and held it. The wood was cold, not metal cold, not the dead battery cold of the horseshoes. A different character, drained, the same drained quality, but spreading, the way water spread through paper. He kept his face arranged. They turned south again, back along the fence line toward the lodge. Keith was looking at him now. Frank let him look. They stopped at the creek overlook, which was not actually on the perimeter route, but was where Keith stopped walking, which was information. He stood at the rail looking down at the creek below, the shallow run of Nakin over limestone, the October clear water, the overhanging willows still half-leafed. The creek murmured, a normal sound, a good sound. "It's the investigation," Keith said. Frank waited. Keith's hands came out of his jacket pockets and went to the top rail. He held it the way he had held the horseshoe, both hands, grip that had some work in it. "After Sarah died," he said, "there was a follow-up piece in the paper, February of '83, 6 months after the accident. The sheriff's department was saying the case had gone cold, no leads on the vehicle, the driver." He stopped for a moment. "I read it at the counter, at the diner where I ate breakfast. I read the whole piece." Frank said nothing. "And when I finished reading it, I put the paper down, and I had 2 things in me at once. The guilt, which I'd been carrying since September. I'd already told Sarah about that in October. I'd already named it." He paused. "And under the guilt, something else. Something I put my hand over very fast and didn't examine." He stopped talking. The creek ran below them. "I was glad the investigation failed," Keith said. "Not glad about Sarah. Not glad she was dead. I want that to be clear, Frank. I was not glad about any of that. I have never been glad about any of that." He said it the way you said something you'd needed to say out loud for a long time, with a carefulness that had been earned. "But the driver disappearing, the case going cold, that erasure, I was glad. Because if the investigation had gone somewhere, if they'd found the driver, if there'd been a trial, if it had stayed in the papers, someone might have started asking who else was on Route 23 that night. Who else drove past? Why nobody stopped?" He let go of the rail. "I was glad a dead woman's killer got away," Keith said, "because it protected me." Frank looked at the creek. He let the confession settle into the October air the way you let something settle that needed to settle, without rushing the edges of it. "That's it," he said. "That's the other layer." "Yes," Keith turned and looked at him. 6 years I sat on that." "You didn't know you were sitting on it. That's different from knowing and not saying." Frank looked at him directly. "The passenger knows. It's been waiting since 1982 for you to find it. And tonight you'll need to say it, out loud, to the reflection." Frank let the instruction lie flat, not more than it needed to be. Everything from 1982 and this part, all of it, no flinching. "And that's enough?" "It was enough last time when you told the whole truth, Frank. This is the rest of the whole truth." Keith nodded. He stood there a moment longer looking at the creek, Frank standing with him. The October afternoon moved overhead in the maples. The willows and Neckin Creek ran over its limestone bed, the same way it had always run, unhurried and indifferent. Then Frank smelled it. Not strong, barely a thread above the ordinary hollow smell, which was creek water and leaf rot and the mineral damp of the limestone below the soil. He had been smelling the ordinary hollow smell for 22 years, and knew its register the way a person knew the smell of their own house. What he caught now was below that register, threaded underneath, a different character entirely, something old and sickly sweet, a sweetness that had nothing clean in it, the way something preserved in the wrong substance smelled when the preservation started to fail. He knew the smell of what the hollow produced in its natural dark moods. He did not know this smell. He said nothing. He noted it. He watched the tree line at the north end of the compound, where the afternoon shadows were already pooling under the canopy an hour earlier than they should have been, the light not touching the ground beneath the far trees, the way the light should have been touching it at 3 in the afternoon. Keith said he was going to sit on the porch and think. Frank said that was fine. He walked with Keith to the lodge porch, watched him settle in the wooden chair with his coffee that he'd reheated, and his horseshoe on his knee. And then Frank walked back to the north fence line. He stood at the fence near Unit 10. He put his hand on the dead horseshoe above the door. Cold. Absolutely cold. In the middle of a mild October afternoon, with the sun still an hour and a half from setting. He looked at the tree line. The shadows that were too early. The spaces between the trees that had a wrong quality to them, a depth that did not match the light. He stood at the fence with his hand on the dead iron for a long time. The smell came again, faint, from the direction of the trees. He took his hand off the iron and put it on the rebar at his belt. The rebar was cold, not deeply cold, not as cold as last night, but cold in a way it had never been in ordinary use, with none of the faint warmth of attentiveness, none of the baseline hum that told him the iron was alert and reading the hollow. It was cold the way something was cold when it was concentrating or when it was afraid. Frank did not have a category for a length of blessed iron being afraid. He took his hand off the rebar and watched the shadows under the north tree line. In the distance, back at the lodge, he could see Keith's shape on the porch, still, the shadow of a man with coffee, turning something over in his mind, working it out for tonight. Frank watched the tree line until the light started to go. Then he went inside to start dinner. The Last Horseshoe, Scene 6. They ate early, before the light was fully gone. Frank made soup from what he had, and bread from the previous morning, and they sat at the counter and ate without ceremony. Keith ate like a man who understood that tonight required fuel, not like a man who was hungry. Frank ate with half his attention on the window and the compound beyond it, where the October dusk was settling, in the particular way it had been settling for the past hour, the shadows at the north end arriving too early, the last of the afternoon light not quite reaching the fence line where it should have. He had been watching this all afternoon. He was still watching it. They talked through the protocol over dinner. Frank went through it from the beginning. The lights, the horseshoe in hand, the position, the mirror, what to say, and how to say it. He was precise about all of it. Keith listened with the focused attention of a man who had done this once and understood that once was not the same as certainty, that surviving something once meant only that you had survived it once, and that the terms had changed in the intervening 6 years. The second layer, Frank said. You go in knowing what it is and you say it anyway. Don't work up to it. Don't soften it. I know. Say the 1982 confession and the new one. Both. In order. No flinching and no qualification. I know, Frank. You came back because you knew something wasn't finished. You worked out what it was this afternoon. Tonight you finish it. Frank pushed the bread toward him. That's all there is to it. Keith took the bread. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It's not easy. Keith looked at him for a moment. Are those different things? Always. They went over it again after dinner, standing on the porch, Keith smoking a cigarette he had produced from somewhere in his jacket. Frank had not seen him smoke in 1982, and noted the addition without commenting on it, and the two of them going through the protocol a second time, Keith reciting it back correctly, and Frank listening and nodding and making one small correction that Keith registered and incorporated without needing it repeated. Satisfied. At 8:35, Frank said, "Stay here." They stood on the lodge porch in the October dark with coffee. Keith had stubbed out the cigarette and was holding his mug in both hands. Frank was watching the mill ruins direction, which was east, back up along Old Mill Road. The night was very still. At 8:47, the siren started. Keith went still at the first note. His coffee mug stayed at chest height, not rising, not lowering. He stood with the quality of a man counting something, and Frank watched him count, watched the recognition move through him as the sound stretched across the hollow and the tree line and the October night, the same sound it had been for as long as Frank had been here and for a long time before that. The abandoned grindstone mill's equipment going off in the dark, the automated thing that had been automated before Frank was born and would likely outlast him, steady and unreasoning and absolute. It faded. Keith let out a breath. His coffee mug descended to his side. He stood looking out at the hollow for a moment. "Still right on time," he said. "Every night," Frank said. The relief in Keith's posture was not total. A man who had just sat through the siren on a night like this was not capable of total relief, not at 8:48 on a Saturday, but it was real. The siren was the thing that was reliable in a hollow where almost nothing else was, and its ordinariness had its own comfort. Frank sent Keith to Unit 8 at 10 o'clock. They walked to the unit door together. Frank watched Keith unlock it and go in, watched the lights come on in sequence, overhead, nightstand, dresser, the stripe of yellow under the bathroom door. The door closed. Frank stood in the October dark in front of Unit 8 and listened to the hollow. Then he started his rounds. He stopped before he reached the end of the south row. The smell, strong enough now that it arrived as a full fact rather than a thread. The creek rot still present, still the ordinary hollow smell of October damp and limestone and leaf decay, but the other thing through it, and over it and under it all at once. Not a thread now, but a presence. Opened graves. Something sickly sweet that had nothing natural in it. A sweetness that suggested preservation rather than ripeness. The chemical sweetness of something that should return to the earth and had not. He stood at the midpoint of the compound between the lodge and Unit 8 and held still. The hollow was quiet. The creek was running. The October night was the October night. The smell was from the north end. He found the rebar in his hand without consciously reaching for it. He looked at it. In the faint light from Unit 8's windows, the blessed iron was visibly cold. A faint condensation along its length, where the warm air met the chill coming off the metal. He had never seen the rebar condense. He had kept it through 10 winters, and he had never seen it condense in a warm season. He walked the full perimeter. He checked every horseshoe on the south row, all good, all functioning, no activity. He approached the north end without hurrying, which was a choice he made deliberately, because hurrying told you something about your own fear that was not always useful, and he could not afford to tell himself that right now. Unit 9, dead. Colder than this afternoon, if anything. Cold in a way that made his palm ache to touch it. Unit 10, dead. Same. He stood between the two units with the rebar in his hand. He looked at the tree line. The shadows beneath the north trees were absolute. Not dark in the way October night was dark. In the way darkness was something laid over the shapes of things, with the shapes still present underneath. These shadows had depth that had no floor. You could not locate what was in them because the looking kept going without finding purchase. Something was in the tree line. He could not see it. He could not hear it. The rebar was cold and quiet and gave him nothing. His father had once told him, standing in this same hollow on an October night 11 years ago, that the things you had no name for were the most important ones to survive. Not because they were necessarily the most dangerous, though sometimes they were, but because having no name for something meant you had no protocol for it. And when you had no protocol, the only thing you had was your attention. He had said, "You pay attention, Franklin. You note everything. You don't decide what it means yet. You keep paying attention until it decides to tell you." Frank paid attention. He did not have a name for what was in the north tree line. He noted the smell, the dead horseshoes, the rebar cold and unresponsive in his hand, the shadows that had no floor. He noted that whatever was there had been there since at least last night and had not approached the compound. He noted that the horseshoes on the south row were functioning normally, that Unit 8 showed lights in every window, that Keith Barnett was doing the most important thing he could do tonight inside those walls. He kept paying attention. He walked the perimeter twice. He returned to the lodge at midnight and sat in the front chair with the rebar across his knees and the window open a half-inch, the way he had kept it open on occupied nights since 1978, so the hollow could not change without him hearing it change. He did not sleep. Unit 8, 11 o'clock. Every light on, horseshoe in hand. Keith sat on the edge of the bed with his back to the dresser mirror, the same position he had held last night. The same covered bridge painting on the wall in front of him, at eye level. He had hung the horseshoe above the door when he came in, then taken it down again and put it back in his hands, because the protocol specified iron in hand for the active part, and the active part had started before he'd had the jacket off. He could feel the mirror behind him, the way you could feel a car running behind you in stopped traffic before you heard it. Directional, present, a fact in the air. He thought about what he was going to say. Not for the first time. He had been working on it since the creek overlook, since he had said it to Frank in the October afternoon, and heard himself say it and understood from the act of saying it out loud that it was true and had been true for 6 years. He'd gotten used to the shape of the 1982 confession, had lived with it long enough that it had smoothed out, the way a stone smoothed in a current. The new part had no smooth edges yet. He was going to have to say a thing he had not said before, to a mirror, in front of whatever was living in that mirror. He was going to have to say it without preparation, without the buffer of time. He was a man who drove routes he had never driven with no map. You learned the street when you were on it. You did not let uncertainty about the destination stop the cab. The cold came at 11:20, faster than last night, faster than he had timed it mentally, 20 minutes. And the mirror behind him was not just cold but aggressively cold, a cold that didn't wait for the temperature in the room to drop first, but arrived as a directional force, as a hand put on the back of your neck in a warm hallway. He gripped the horseshoe. The iron pushed back. He could feel the border establish itself. Then both faces. He didn't look. He kept his eyes on the covered bridge painting, and he felt both of them the way you felt weather from 2 directions, not the same cold, not the same pressure. The familiar cold of the passenger as he had known it for 6 years. Sarah's presence, the shape he associated with the back seat of the Checker Marathon, the woman in the newspaper photograph with the flat Midwestern smile. And underneath, or behind that, the second cold, the one that had been at the periphery last night and the night before and all 8 months before that, the one that had been trying to resolve into something and had not, until now. It was resolving. He kept his eyes front. He knew what it was going to be. He had known since the creek overlook. He could feel the shape of it, the way he could feel the shape of a one-way street before he saw the sign. Something in the proportions, something in how the traffic was moving. The voice came, almost his own, wrong in pitch. You were glad he got away. Keith breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, deliberate, measured, the kind of breathing that kept you steady at 4 a.m. when the fare was complicated and the night was long. He spoke to the mirror without turning around. I drove past Sarah Connolly on Route 23 on September 14th, 1982, he said. I was in my cab, I had a fare, and I saw her on the shoulder, and I drove past because I didn't want to deal with the stop or the time or the explanation. I drove past, and she died waiting for someone to help who never came. He paused. He had said all of this before, in this room in 1982. He said it again because Frank had said say all of it, and because the 1982 words needed to be present in the room for the new words to land in the right place. I was relieved when she died. Not about her death, not about the dying, about the not being there. She was gone, and she couldn't tell anyone what she'd seen or what she'd needed. And I had been carrying the guilt, and I was also carrying relief, and I was ashamed of the relief, but it was real. The cold intensified. No retreat. The opposite. A press forward, a narrowing of the border, the horseshoe doing what it could, and him feeling the full effort of what it could. He gripped the iron. He kept going. February of 1983, he said. There was a follow-up in the paper. The sheriff's department was saying the case went cold. No vehicle identified. No driver. I sat at the diner counter and I read the whole thing, and when I put the paper down, I had 2 things in me. He said it the way he had said it to Frank at the creek overlook. No flinching, no qualification, but it was different to say it here, to the mirror and whatever was in the mirror, with the cold pressing against the iron and the wrong-pitched voice in the air. It had more weight here. He had known it would. I was glad the investigation failed. Not glad she was dead. Not glad someone killed her. Glad her killer disappeared, because her killer disappearing meant no investigation, no trial, no newspaper coverage that ran long enough for someone to start asking who else had been on Route 23 that night. What other cars went past. He made himself say the last part clean. I was glad a woman's murderer got away free, because that freedom protected me. silence. For 3 seconds, there was no cold, no press against the iron, no wrong voice in the air. Just the 3 seconds of the October night and the covered bridge on the wall and his own breathing. Then the cold came again, harder, sudden, the hardest press he had felt in 2 nights. He held the horseshoe with everything he had and did not turn around. The cold lasted 40 seconds. He counted them. He counted them the way he counted city blocks when he was learning a new route, with the automatic precision of a man for whom numbers were a kind of ballast, 1 through 40. The horseshoe was searing warm against his palms. Then the cold retreated. Not in stages this time. All at once. Pop. The October night, the creek outside, his own breathing, the covered bridge painting. The room at the temperature a room was supposed to be at in mid-October with 3 lamps burning. He waited. He counted to 60, then 60 again. Nothing. He looked at the mirror. His own face. The room behind him, the bathroom door ajar, the 3 lit lamps. And in the mirror, for a moment, not behind him, not threatening, not pressing through reflective surfaces from somewhere else, Sarah Connolly's face. 23 years old. The newspaper photograph face, the flat Midwestern smile, the clear eyes. Just her face in the mirror, the way his own face was in the mirror, present still, looking back at him. She did not speak. She did not accuse. She looked at him the way you looked at someone you were finished with, which was different from the way you looked at someone you were done with. And he understood the difference without being able to put words to it. She faded. The second presence, the shape of his younger self, the version of Keith Barnett who had sat at a diner counter in February of 1983 and felt the private, shameful relief of an erasure, that presence faded with her, not gradually but completely, the way a thought leaves when you finally say it out loud and it stops needing to live inside you. The mirror was a mirror, reflecting the room, reflecting him. Keith set the horseshoe on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while looking at it, the way you looked at a tool after a hard job, with a kind of acknowledgement of what the job had required and what the tool had done. His hands were aching. He was 58 years old and had been gripping iron for 2 nights. He lay back on the bed, fully dressed, the way he had lain down in this unit 6 years ago, but without the watchfulness, without the position holding, without the sense of a siege still in progress. The ceiling of Unit 8 was the same ceiling it had been in 1982. Pine boards with a water stain near the east corner that looked like a bird in flight. The unit air was clean. Not the pine cleaner clean of occupancy, but the other clean, the kind that arrived after something had departed. He had felt it once before, in this room. He had been hoping he would feel it again, and not been certain he would. He stared at the bird-shaped water stain. That's all of it, he thought. That's the whole truth. He didn't sleep for a while. But the not sleeping was different from the previous night, was not watching or holding position or waiting for the next thing. He was processing. Running the route back through his mind, the way he ran new routes after the first drive, noting the turns and the landmarks and where the traffic would be bad at different hours. He had driven past Sarah Connolly on September 14th, 1982. He had been relieved when she died. He had been glad her killer disappeared, because the disappearance protected him. He had carried all 3 of these things for 6 years, the first 2 with full knowledge, and the third without, and had come back to Ironwood in October of 1988, and said all of them out loud to a mirror in a room that was listening. The passenger was gone. He was certain. He had been certain of it in 1982, and had been wrong about the completeness, and he was certain again now, and was choosing to trust the certainty because it felt different from the 1982 certainty, deeper, cleaner, like a bearing set true rather than a guess. At some point, the not sleeping became sleeping, though he couldn't have said exactly when. The unit was quiet. The hollow outside was quiet. Naken Creek ran over its limestone bed, the same way it always ran. Outside, in the north tree line, the shadows pooled their wrong depth in the October dark. And Frank Harmon sat in his chair by the open window with the rebar across his knees, waiting for the hollow to tell him what he was dealing with. The Last Horseshoe, Scene 7. The light came first through the gap in the curtains, thin and pale, the October sun not yet clearing the tree line. Keith lay on the bed fully dressed and watched the ceiling lighten by degrees, and did not move until the room was fully lit and he was certain, with all of himself, that there was nothing left in it to move away from. He sat up. The mirror above the dresser was just a mirror. He looked at it directly, which he had not done since Friday night, and what looked back was a 58-year-old man who had not slept and knew it. Bags under the eyes, shirt creased from lying in it. The grey that had been threading through his hair for the last decade had completed the work somewhere along the way. He couldn't say when he'd last looked and seen anything different. He looked at the mirror for a long moment. Nothing looked back but him. He put his hands on his knees and pushed himself up off the bed. The horseshoe was on the nightstand where he'd set it in the early hours, after the cold had retreated and the room had come back to being just a room. He picked it up out of habit, then set it down again. It wasn't his. It was Ironwood's. He left it on the nightstand and went to the bathroom and ran water on his face until the cold of it cleared the last of the night's residue out of his head. Outside, the October morning was doing what October mornings in Ohio do when they decide to be honest about themselves. Cold and clear, no cloud cover, the trees blazing on 3 sides of the compound in colours that had no business being as vivid as they were. The kind of morning that looked like the last good thing before winter shut everything down. Keith stood on Unit 8's porch for a while without moving and looked at it. The word that kept trying to form wasn't right. He tested it anyway. Lighter. Not lighter, exactly, but closer than anything else he had. He'd put something down last night, something he hadn't even known he was carrying. Not in full, not by its right name, not until he'd said it out loud to a mirror in a room with every light burning and the horseshoe in both hands. The saying of it had not made him feel good. It had not made him feel forgiven or clean, or any of the things he'd half-imagined confession might produce. What it had made him feel was honest. For the first time in 6 years, honest all the way down. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. But he knew how to drive, and he knew the way home, and he supposed the rest of it would work itself out in the cab over the next few hours, the way most of his thinking did. Frank was on the lodge porch with his coffee when Keith came across the compound with his bag over his shoulder. Frank watched him cross without saying anything, reading whatever was in the way Keith was walking. Keith climbed the porch steps and set the bag down and stood for a moment looking at the hollow spread out beyond the tree line, the colour, the creek glinting where it caught the light. "It's done this time," Keith said. "Isn't it?" Frank looked at him. "Looks that way." "How do you know the difference?" Frank considered this, which for Frank was a brief pause rather than a long one. "The air in the unit, the way you're standing, the way the hollow feels right now." "A beat. You know the difference, too." Keith thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "I do." They went inside, and Frank wrote the receipt at the front desk, the practical business of it, maintained with the same care Frank gave everything here. Keith paid and took the receipt and folded it into his wallet without looking at it. Frank poured them both coffee, and they stood on the porch a while longer without talking, the way 2 men can stand together without talking when they have enough history between them, and nothing left that needs to be said. When Keith picked up his bag, Frank went with him as far as the marathon. The cab sat where Keith had left it Friday afternoon, yellow against the October colours. The chrome markers and the Columbus Cab Company placard faded but intact. 10 years old now, and it looked it, the paint oxidized at the roofline, the front quarter panel where he'd backed into a dumpster 3 winters ago, still showing the crease. He'd never gotten around to having it pulled. He wasn't sure he ever would. He put the bag in the trunk and closed it, stood there a moment with his hand on the lid, looking at the hollow. "The mirror," he said. "It's going to be different now?" "Should be," Frank said. Keith looked at the back door of the marathon, the window, the rear view. "Should be," he said. "Check it anyway," Frank said. "For a while. Old habits are good habits." Keith almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighbourhood of one. He got in. The driver's seat shaped itself around him the way it always did, 6 years of his particular weight and posture built into the springs. He fit here. He always had. He put the key in, and before he started the engine, he reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror and looked into it. The back seat, empty. Clean empty. No wrong quality to the air, no half-second lag before the reflection caught up to what it was seeing, no presence at the edge of peripheral vision. The Marathon's back seat was a back seat, scarred vinyl and the faint ghost of 10,000 fares, and nothing else. He started the engine. Frank stood in the gravel drive with his coffee and watched the yellow cab back out, turn, find the entrance, and move down toward Maple Grove Road. It went around the curve with the October trees blazing on both sides, and then it was gone, and the sound of the engine faded, and the hollow settled back into its Sunday quiet. Frank stood in the drive for a moment. He looked at the trees. He looked at the closed doors of the 9 empty units. Then he turned and walked toward the lodge porch, and 2 steps from the bottom of the steps the smell hit him, and he stopped. It was not the creek. It was not the ordinary rot of fall, the mulch and the turned earth and the slow vegetable decay of November working its way forward through October. It was underneath all of that, threading through it with the patience of something that had been waiting since before patience had a word. His hand went to the rebar at his belt. The rebar was ice cold. The smell was coming from the direction of the lodge, from inside the lodge through the open door. Something was already in there. The Last Horseshoe Scene 8, The Encounter Part 1. Frank did not go in. Not yet. He stood 2 steps from the porch and held still and breathed through his mouth to test the smell and let his mind do what 10 years had trained it to do. Assess before engaging. Read the available information before committing to a direction. The smell was wrong in a specific way he had no file for. He knew the penitent smell, damp stone and cold iron, and the mineral clarity of deep water. He knew the passenger's smell, stale upholstery and old grief, road hours distilled into something that clung. He knew the lesser manifestations, the ones that appeared at fence lines or drew shapes in cold frosted windows and faded when the light changed. They all had their particular character, the way animals have scent, and in 10 years he had catalogued them without being aware he was doing it. This was not in the catalogue. Opened graves and something sweet underneath it. Sweet the way decay is sweet when it has been preserved a long time in something airless. Not rot exactly, but the memory of rot, the record of it, kept intact. And beneath even that, a weight. The way the air feels before a lightning strike, when the charge builds in everything, and the hair on your arms lifts, and you know something enormous is about to make itself known. He was still holding the rebar. He made himself look at it. His father's rebar, blessed the winter before his father's hands started shaking and the arthritis took his grip, carried every night since. Frank had touched this iron 10,000 times, had felt it hum against his palm when the penitent moved through the compound in the small hours, had felt it warm through his gloves on the nights the lesser things tested the fence line. He knew the feel of it, the way he knew the feel of his own face. It was cold. Not October cold. The cold of something from which all the warmth had been drawn completely. The cold of iron that had never known warmth and never would. It was silent in his hand. He put the rebar back on his belt and kept his hand on it anyway, because removing his hand from it felt like letting go of something essential. And he went up the porch steps and stood in the open doorway of the lodge. The lodge was empty. Dim inside, the morning light coming through the west windows at a low angle, the coffee mugs still on the counter from earlier. His chair, the front desk, the shelf where the horseshoes were kept for new guests, the spare keys on their hooks, the radio he listened to in the evenings, all of it exactly as he'd left it. He stood in the doorway and studied the room. Then he turned and looked down the drive toward Maple Grove Road, and he saw the figure coming up it. A man in a postal uniform, walking up the gravel drive with his head down and a leather satchel across one shoulder. The uniform was wrong before Frank could say specifically how it was wrong. The cut of it, the style of it, something that belonged to an earlier decade, precise and crisp in a way that working uniforms are not in practice. in the way that a uniform in a photograph from 30 years ago is crisp and particular, because photographs preserve what time changes. The crease of the trousers, the set of the jacket across the shoulders, everything too exact, too maintained, too there. Frank watched him come up the drive. The figure's pace was even, unhurried, the walk of a man with a route to finish, nothing particular about the stride, except that after a moment, Frank could not quite track where the feet were making contact with the gravel. The gravel should have crunched. The gravel was not crunching. Frank stood very still in the lodge doorway. The figure reached the midpoint of the drive, and then it looked up. It looked directly at Frank. And it smiled. The smile began normally enough, the corners of the mouth pulling, a social expression, a greeting. But it kept going. It spread by degrees that did not follow how human faces move, by fractions too deliberate, too geometrically even on both sides, the teeth appearing at a rate that had clearly been calibrated from observation rather than from the inside knowledge of what smiling actually feels like. It was a smile reproduced by something that had watched smiling from the outside for a very long time and understood every component of it, except the part that made it real. Frank's stomach understood before his mind did. His stomach understood immediately and completely, and his mind spent a half-second catching up. He did not run. The figure crossed the remaining gravel with the same even unhurried pace, and came up the porch steps and walked through the open lodge door, and as it passed through the door, the horseshoe above the frame made a sound. Frank had heard horseshoes hum with proximity to the creatures they warded against. He had heard them vibrate, had felt that vibration transfer through the doorframe into his palm when he was standing close. He had heard, twice in 10 years, the brief tonal shift when something pressed against the perimeter and the iron pushed back. He had never heard anything like this. One note, low and resonant, almost musical, almost like a bell struck underwater, the tone carrying through the doorframe and through the porch boards and into the soles of his boots. One note, sustained for the span of 2 heartbeats. Then silence. Not the silence of a ward at rest. The silence of iron that has stopped existing as what it was. Frank looked up at the horseshoe above the door. It hung where it had always hung, on the pre-existing nail, the same iron that had been there since his father put it up in 1976. Unchanged. Unbroken. Inert, in the way that a clock is inert when its mechanism has been removed, and what remains is only the casing. He turned from the door. The postal uniform was gone. What stood in the lodge wore darkness, the way living things wear skin. Not darkness as the absence of light. Darkness with substance, with mass, with the accumulated weight of something that had been patient for longer than patience had a name. It was pooling at the edges, accumulating in the corners of the room, drawing available light toward itself the way a drain draws water, and the lodge was dimmer than it had any right to be with October morning coming through 3 windows. The temperature dropped between one breath and the next. Frank's coffee mug frosted on the outside, a fine crystalline layer appearing across the ceramic as he watched. The smell arrived fully. Frank gripped the rebar at his belt, cold, silent, offering nothing. He stood his ground. The darkness gathered, deeper now, pooling and accumulating, and from its depths something began to emerge. The hands first. The Last Horseshoe, Scene 9, The Encounter, Part 2. Impossibly long fingers, each joint bending backward with a grace that belonged to nothing. Frank had a name for, a suppleness that went the wrong direction at every articulation, fluid and deliberate and completely alien to any creature he had encountered in 10 years of this work. The skin the color of curdled milk, pulled tight over bulging knuckles. He could see the bones shifting beneath it, not settling, but reforming with every subtle movement, as if the structure of the hand was a suggestion the thing was entertaining temporarily. A second hand followed, the fingers weaving around each other in slow patterns that hurt Frank's eyes to track. He stopped trying to track them. He had read his father's accounts. He had read the older Guardian records his father kept in the locked cabinet, the accounts from the men before his father, the accumulated observations going back far enough that the handwriting in the oldest ones was a script that had stopped being common sometime around the First World War. He had read the descriptions. He had discounted them. Not entirely, not consciously, but somewhere in the part of him that needed the world to remain manageable, he had filed those descriptions as the product of frightened men describing something they didn't understand, reaching for the worst language they had because the actual encounter had overwhelmed their capacity to be precise. He had told himself, the accounts are real, but the descriptions are the fear-talking. He understood now that the descriptions had been restrained. Above the hands, where a face would be on anything natural, two voids, not darkness, absence. Twin vacancies so complete that the dim lodge, by comparison, seemed bright. Frank looked at them, and his mind reached for a frame of reference, and found nothing to hold on to, the way your foot reaches for the next step in the dark and finds only air. Frank did not look away. He understood, in some pre-verbal part of himself that operated below thought, that looking away was not an option available to him, not because of threat, because of simple witness. He was the one present. He would see this. The rebar hung from his belt, ice-cold and mute. He did not draw it. He knew, with the same wordless certainty with which he knew most things about Ironwood after a decade here, that the rebar would accomplish nothing in this room, that the blessed iron his father had pressed into his hands with the gravity of inheritance had no framework for what was standing in his lodge. It was not a failure of the iron. It was the difference between a lock on a door and a tide. The dark entity did not advance. It stood in his lodge, and it was entirely, unhurriedly present, and it did not move toward him, and Frank understood, before the communication arrived, that it was not here for him. He was incidental to this. He was the messenger, because he was the one who happened to be standing here, because the lodge was here, and Ironwood was here, and the hollow was here, and what the hollow was had been drawing this attention for reasons that predated Frank Harmon by longer than his bloodline had existed. Then the communication arrived. It did not come as words, it did not come as sound, or as a voice in his head, or as anything he could have described as language in the ordinary sense. It arrived the way understanding arrives in dreams, fully formed and impossible to unknow, present in his mind before he was aware of receiving it, like stones dropping into still water, each one complete, each one final. He understood that every creature he had ever guarded against at Ironwood, the penitent and the passenger and the lesser things at the fence line, were expressions of something they had never been the source of. That they were the way the hollow's hunger made itself known, the shapes it wore when it fed on guilt and grief, and the unfinished business of people who came here carrying weight. They were real. They were genuinely dangerous. They were also, in the way that symptoms are real and genuinely dangerous, not the disease. He understood that Ironwood sat on ground that had been aware of what was beneath it for longer than any guardian lineage. That the native peoples who had lived in this valley had known it, had named it in their own way, had kept their distance from the hollow for reasons they understood correctly. That when the settlers came, the knowledge had been offered in the way such knowledge can be offered, indirectly, through the behavior of people who knew, and the settlers had dismissed it, which was their nature. And the guardians who came later had built their protocols on the foundation the settlers left, which meant the protocols had a hole in them from the beginning that no one had known to look for. He understood that the wards worked. The horseshoes and the iron and the protocols, the rules Frank had kept and enforced and taught to every person who came through Ironwood's gate in 10 years. They worked. They addressed what they were built to address. He had not been wrong. He had not failed. He had been treating a fever without knowing there was an infection beneath it. And the fever was real, and the treatment was real, and the infection had simply been waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. Not as a threat delivered. As a fact stated, the way winter is coming in October, it has always been coming, it was always going to arrive, and the only question that ever existed was when. A confrontation, a specific person, a moment already shaped and moving toward its resolution, the way a debt moves toward its due date, indifferent to whether the debtor is ready. He understood, and this was the piece that would send him to his desk, that it remembered a boy, that it had encountered the boy before, that the encounter had registered for the boy and had registered for the entity in different ways, but it had registered, that the boy was the reason it had come to Ironwood today, to this outpost at the edge of its territory, to Frank specifically, because the web of connections between this place and that boy needed to know. The game had begun. That the boy, 16 in March of 1985 and 18 now, was marked in the way that certain people are marked, the way certain events create obligations in both directions, and the entity had come today to confirm that it was aware of the marking, and that Frank, who had seen the boy and filed what he saw and never acted on it, should be aware of it too. Frank would die. Not today. That was the last piece dropped in with the same flat certainty as all the others, complete malice without heat, the way a surgeon states a prognosis. The people who would stand in this fight would die. The fight itself was not avoidable. The losses within it were not negotiable. This was stated not as a threat, but as information. The kind of information you give to a messenger because the message would be incomplete without it. Then it withdrew, not retreating. Withdrawing, the way a tide withdraws, with complete, unhurried certainty that it would return when it chose. The darkness receded from the corners of the room, the pooled shadows lightened by degrees, ordinary morning shadow becoming ordinary morning light. The temperature normalized over several minutes, the frost on Frank's coffee mug releasing, a thin trickle of condensation running down the side of the ceramic. The smell faded last. The sickly sweet decay hung in the lodge air for a long time after the darkness was gone, the last evidence of what had been present, and Frank stood in the middle of his lodge and did not move until it too had cleared. He turned to the door. The horseshoe hung above the frame exactly as it had hung since 1976. Iron, just iron. On its nail, in its place, unchanged in any way he could see, gone in every way that mattered. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he went to the door and opened it. The October morning was exactly as it had been. The trees blazing. Nakin Creek audible from the east fence line, running cold over the rock bed. A bird in the tree line, 2 notes repeated, indifferent to everything that had just occurred in the lodge behind him. The gravel drive empty. The 9 occupied horseshoes on their nails above 9-unit doors, functional and real, and exactly as much as they had always been, which he now understood was exactly as much as they could ever be. He closed the door, locked it, looked up at the dead horseshoe. He left it there. He walked to his desk. The last horseshoe epilogue. The pen moved. Frank had never been a fast writer. He composed carefully, the way he did most things, the words coming one at a time and placed where he intended them. Letters to suppliers, notes in the guest log, the occasional correspondence with Harold that he had been meaning to send and had put off across 15 months of putting off. The pen was moving faster than it had ever moved at this desk. The letter was addressed to Harold McKinnon, Willow's Bend. That much was visible at the top of the page. Below it, the pen kept moving. He thought about his father. His father had given him the rebar with the gravity of a man passing on a sufficient thing. The hollow iron blessed and handed over with the knowledge of 30 years behind the gesture. The understanding that this tool worked, had always worked, was the right tool for the work. His father had not been wrong. He had not been lying or careless or incomplete in any way he could have known to be complete. He had given Frank everything he had, and everything he had been enough for everything his father had ever faced. His father had never faced what was in Frank's lodge this morning. Frank thought about that without anger. His father had kept the watch and passed it on, and the watch was real, and the work was real, and none of that changed. It was only the size of the thing that had changed, or rather, the size of the thing had always been what it was, and the measure of it had simply been unavailable until now. He thought about the last 10 years. The guests who had come through Ironwood's gate carrying their weights, the ones who had faced what came for them and walked away, the ones who had not. He thought about what he had been doing across those years, and he did not diminish it. The work was real. The wards worked on what they were built for. He had been correct in everything he understood, and what he had not understood was not a failure of care or intelligence or dedication. He had been guarding the fence line. The thing he was meant to guard against did not see fence lines. He thought about the dead horseshoe above the door, the iron that had gone silent in the span of one note, and he thought about replacing it, and he understood he was not going to replace it. Not because it would be pointless, though it would be. Because leaving it was honest, and he had learned something this morning about what honesty costs and what it is worth, and he intended to maintain that learning. He thought about a boy doing spring maintenance in March of 1985, 16 years old, with something in him that Frank had recognized and filed and never acted on, because acting on it would have required Frank to understand what the recognition meant, and he had not been ready to understand it. The boy was 18 now. He needs to be warned, Frank thought. Not by me, by Harold, by someone who understands what marked means and what it costs. He thought, 10 years. 10 years and I didn't know the right question. The pen kept moving. Outside, through the locked lodge door, Ironwood Retreat sat quiet in the October morning. The hollow blazed with colour. Niken Creek ran cold and clear over the rock bed below the east fence. The 10 units stood in their 2 rows, horseshoes above every door, 9 of them functional, 1 of them dead iron that used to be a ward. The hollow was watching. It was always watching. But today the watching felt different. Less like patience, more like anticipation. Frank wrote faster.